This is Rising Tides, Episode 1, Indigenous Conservation Excellence. Hi, I'm Colette Anton, Communications Coordinator at the Ash Center, and today I'm here with Dr. Miriam Jorgensen and Dr. Laura Taylor of the Harvard Project on Indigenous Governance and Development Landback Research Team. Could you both please briefly introduce yourselves?
Sure. My name's Miriam Jorgensen. I'm a senior researcher at the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, and I also serve as research director of the Harvard Project on Indigenous Governance and Development.
And hello, thank you for having us. I'm Laura Taylor, and I'm a research affiliate with the Harvard Project, and I'm also with the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Science.
Great, thank you both. So happy to have you here. My first question for you, can you both share more about your work with the Harvard Project on Indigenous Governance and Development and why you chose to work on researching landback initiatives?
I'm just going to take this out of the box because I'm so old that I figure I get some primacy here. I've been with the Harvard Project since 1989 when I came to the Kennedy School as a candidate for the Master of Public Policy degree. And I met Joe Kalt, who was the founder of one of the co-founders of the Harvard Project, which was then called the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, during sort of the dog and pony show that they do sometimes, or maybe used to do, who knows if they still do, when the MPPs first come in. And professors were kind of parading in, talking about their research, so we could get a better idea of kind of who we were working with at the school. And I was completely stunned to see that there was somebody working on at the time, American Indian economic development issues, because that is what I came to the school to do, but I was told that there's nobody here working on it. And so to see him talk about it and be engaged with it was exciting. So through the 2 years of my MPP, and then I stayed to do a PhD in political economy and government, this has been sort of the focus of my work. So I grew up with the Harvard Project, sort of as becoming kind of both a functioning adult and also as an academic and professional researcher who does community engaged research.
And I have been with the Harvard Project since 2015 and had a sort of similar in some brushstrokes,
but much later,
introduction to the Harvard Project, which was that I also met Joe Kalt, who started the Harvard Project a little bit before then, after working for several years in Australia on issues of wage theft from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the state of Queensland. And so I came back to the United States to sort of see, is anyone else doing interesting work on this crazy post-colonial situation with Indigenous nations and other types of legal entities. And I found Joe Kalt. And so I became affiliated with the Harvard Project when I started my PhD in economics at the University of Arizona. And the Harvard Project was really a natural fit at that point in my career. I was really interested in looking deeply at frameworks that underlie societies, and especially where societal institutions collide. And the Harvard Project is such a unique group in that it was really founded on these principles of working alongside tribal partners to learn from each other and to develop and deploy really practical research for policy and governance. I always thought if I worked in academia, I wanted to be practical and meaningful in the real world, not just the theory or theoretical world. And my work as an economist has really followed those principles in that I'm really interested in using the most rigorous and transparent approaches to help make sense of a really complex world. And so this has led to really hands-on and engaged work on complex problems like landback and like the work that the Harvard Project does. Aside from issues of wage theft in Australia, I also came to the Harvard Project after doing recession forecasting in New York City and continued working on water rights in the Western United States, again, adding data and rigor to a deep understanding of the complex world.
So Laura, my expertise, I think, meshes really well. I've been doing a lot of work in the mid to late teens around issues related to natural resources, federal land management practices, even related to art and culture, where that intersects with land. So it became kind of an obvious thing to begin to talk a lot to Laura while she was working on her PhD, to start to get a better idea of what her interests were. And because my main affiliation was the University of Arizona. And so we ran kind of in the same circles a bit. But COVID-19 came along, and the Harvard Project had a unique standing to be a trusted voice in a lot of the noise that was happening at the time. And we began to write a series of briefs for Indian country, but particularly aimed at the Department of the Treasury and the Department of the Interior and the responses they were making to the COVID-19 crisis. And we began to gather around us some experts who were working on a wide variety of issues. A couple of them were coming out of the philanthropic sector, and they said, you guys have been doing a pretty good job with this. We're interested if you would be working on some other issues that are on the table for us. And one of the issues they brought to us was saying, we need some better work going on. They were especially interested in the issues around philanthropy and Landback and the sort of way that those intertwined. So bizarrely, it was engagement in national policy issues and the creation of greater partners that led to the ask. And for us, Laura's kind of hit on this a little bit with what the style of work that the Harvard Project does. It's intended to be engaged in the community. It's intended to be responsive. It's intended to bring the best research evidence we can so that Native nations have the information to wrestle with to make good decisions and build capacity. So in a responsive fashion, we said, sure, we'll work on that. And a couple of papers emerged from that turned into our broader Landback project.
That's fantastic, and I think it might lead right into my next question here. So, Miriam, your most recent Landback policy brief was titled Experts, Not Obstacles, Indigenous Conservation Excellence and the Trap of Conservation at Any Cost, which was also the inspiration for the name of this episode of Rising Tides. Can you tell us more about how you selected this title and how it summarizes your findings?
Sure. And I should just give a shout out to my co-authors. The lead author in that is a Native Hawaiian man, Kavika Riley. He was assisted by Blackfeet descendant Brittany Nyan. And our other co-author is Monty Mills from the University of Washington, whom many folks will know of. And so the four of us together wrote this paper in response to the request that again came from partners and colleagues in some of the COVID-19 work we were doing. And there was this concern around, if Landback is going on, it's actually related to this other big movement out there, which is the increasing movement to try to preserve and protect lands in the United States. The Biden 30 by 30 initiative was going on. There were other big initiatives to try to pursue greater conservation, conservation outcomes from various land-based projects all over the United States. And the tendency that was reported to us from our partners and colleagues was that mainstream foundations tended to do what they had termed, and this sounds a little pejorative, fortress conservation. Like, we're going to take a piece of land or a forest or a natural resource area and basically kind of put a notional fence around it, because the best way to protect land is to just let it be, let it kind of go back to itself. And that really denies millennia of caretaking and relationship that Indigenous people have had with their lands and waters. And so we were challenged to find out if the published peer-reviewed scientific literature pointed in the direction of one approach or the other. So we undertook, the four of us, a scoping review, which is kind of a literature review with a very strict analytic lens applied to it. And we began with 1,500 articles over looking at about the past 10 years, and found that only 37 of them met our criteria, which were that there had to be an Indigenous people involved, an Indigenous community. So not just any local community, and anybody who's aware of the debate out there in the international literature between the difference of an Indigenous community, indigenous to a place, and a local community that may have moved there or and have kind of developed in that space knows that debate. So an Indigenous community, that there was a clear description of a conservation practice and that there was a clear description of an outcome, because we wanted to be able to really make that connection between Indigenous people acting on the land, engaging in conservation, and seeing an outcome. Out of those 37 articles, 59% of them, so just about, 3/5, showed that a superior outcome came from Indigenous conservation practices. And when we looked kind of under the hood a little bit more for places where there was an expansion of land rights, 75% of those, so it was only 12, but still 3/4 of them showed that there was a superior outcome in those cases. The numbers are small, but we think they're strongly indicative of the fact that the scientific peer-reviewed literature points to the fact that rather than seeing Indigenous people as obstacles to the fortress conservation idea of, hey, stay away, this is not really your land to look after, but when Indigenous people really engage in their relationship with lands and waters and engage in those conservation practices, they're getting superior outcomes to what, just letting nature be would do. And that's just, I think, a really critical finding.
Very striking findings. Thank you so much for sharing. I think, I'm very interested to hear about what you are doing right now. In particular, could you both share more about the Landback dataset you are building and how it plans to blend data and storytelling in partnership with tribes?
Yeah, so I'll jump in to kick this off. The platform that we're building as part of the Landback project is really a merging of this qualitative and quantitative information. Again, very much in line with the Harvard Project approach and our individual research approaches. And I should say, just as an aside too, Miriam discussed how there were kind of several different types of experts that had been convened for the COVID types of briefs, and that people came with different expertise to weigh in on these difficult policy things. And I know for me, when I first came aboard the Landback project, I had just done this significant mapping project at the University of Arizona, mapping the nature, location, and mechanisms effectively of Indigenous land loss at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century in the Western United States on a parcel by parcel level. So we had been able to use GIS to kind of visualize the story of Western settlement and land encroachment. And so we wanted to kind of use that in combination, like that technology in combination with the deep qualitative information to understand in a granular way the nature of these Landback events, including deep dives into contextualizing regional histories and stories across the United States, because Landback opportunities are very different, for example, in California than they might be, say, in New Jersey. Our nation is very diverse and has very divergent histories. And so we are attempting to be as exhaustive as possible, both in understanding differences in these regional histories and laws, while also understanding basically the what, why, and how of Landback and its relevance to tribal governments and other outcomes, including environmental or socioeconomic ones. And so this platform is going to be the foundation to help answer some of these questions in both an empirical and a qualitative way.
I love that description, Laura, because I think it really hits on the kinds of things that the Harvard Project does well, which is we can be responsive to questions and needs in communities and develop policy responses. We can and analysis. We can point people to research that's already out there, and then we can also take this longer view too. And that's the advantage of being in an academic institution and having access to resources that allow us to do that, like undergraduate RAs and things like that. So we're trying to build something that's bigger than just a list of news stories, but that looks at these other kinds of questions that Laura's raising. And I think that while we have some short-term wins, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those in a minute, but we're also looking to the longer term to try to think about what are those social science as understandings that we can glean from building a big data set like this, and then how does that benefit Native nations and tribal governments? Because that's really part of our vision and goal.
Yeah, and one aside that you just reminded me of too, but it's really important, it's not a side note, is that this project also serves as a really great way to mentor and train students, particularly Indigenous students who might be at Harvard or at other institutions. We've had people come from a very wide range of places, and we can bring them in to do this rigorous style of research. We can learn from them and they can learn from us, and it's really served as this very powerful, we've probably had about a dozen different affiliated students and individuals over the course of just a few short years of this project, and that's been a really important component as well.
That's incredible. Now, I know you mentioned short-term wins, so I want to give you an opportunity to chat about those a little. I hear you also work together on a Landback policy brief focused on considerations for federal and state landback. Could you share some of the key findings from that report to close us out?
Absolutely. So, considerations for federal and state landback, that piece really helps draw together what we call like the low-hanging fruit for landback events that sit in this state or federal land type of area. And really that brief was written to present some baseline findings, but also to help speak to individuals who might be less familiar with what landback is, the nature of landback, and help serve as a little bit of an educational piece of some of these evocative, broad questions that are, easy to communicate with, say, maps and other visual types of graphics. So the majority of indigenous land was encroached upon by Western settlers by the end of the treaty-making era in the latter half of the 19th century. But even after reservations were established and land was ostensibly contracted over and protected, there were over 100 million acres that were further lost between 1880 and 1915 as the federal government invested in infrastructure and encouraged Western settlement. We know about land loss, but we thought, what happened to that land? If it was ostensibly transferred for certain stated goals and aims, did those goals and aims happen? We found in writing that policy brief that approximately a third of what had been reservation land in 1880 and was taken out of reservation status is still just federal land, managed and or owned by the federal government across 6 different major federal agencies. And making maps of these areas helps beg the obvious question, why did we do that? And are those parcels ripe for land return now?
I think these are the kinds of questions that cause us all to think a little bit harder. Laura and I are both settler scholars. We're not Indigenous. And I think that this kind of information that we can produce ends up being a message that we can take to other non-Indigenous actors out there, and that Indigenous scholars can use to make important points, and activists can use to make important points too. So we've seen this work be picked up by folks like Kevin Washburn writing about landback, and we did it in response to questions raised by, like we said, several of our colleagues in the other work, and just want to give a shout out to them, to Jody Archambault and to Burton Warrington, who really pushed us in this direction, and the sort of team that we convened in 2023 or 2 that was very at the outset of some of our just exploration of this project. I want to jump on the point that Laura made, though, about the federal government still owning a lot of this land. And when you think about what that means, 2 things. Historically, it means that we kind of have been telling the wrong story about land taken during the allotment era. The story that I learned as a kid growing up in South Dakota, as I looked around me at all the sections of land that were out there, is that all this was surveyed because there was this westward expansion push, right? And then it all went to settlers who were going to get their 12 acres and a plow or whatever it is. And yet the story we see from these maps is that, yeah, absolutely some of it went to settlers, but the rest of it was kept by the federal government. And it has this nice name, public lands. But it raises this question of whose lands are those public lands, right? If you look at the entities within the federal government that control these lands, 2 of the big ones are the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service, and both of them have congressionally mandated processes for engaging the public. And important publics in that, or senior stakeholders, and I hate that word stakeholder, but senior rights holders in that process are Native nations. And if you think about what the Experts But Not Obstacles work says about the land management practices that should be considered by the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service, if they're not going to give the land back, they ought to at least be giving primacy to the stewardship ideas of tribes. And I think Experts About Obstacles shows exactly the reasons why. I told you I was doing a lot of work previously on sort of natural resources management and public lands management, and one piece that I did with Kem Nessifer and Carla Borlier in 2022 for Pew Charitable Trust looks at exactly this set of questions around what are the decision-making processes on federal public lands. And I think that there are real opportunities there if the land isn't going to be directly given back for increased stewardship by Native people. And we hope that some of our research helps both Indigenous, non-Indigenous policymakers, activists, and academics look at these points even harder.
Well, I just want to say thank you both so much for joining us for Rising Tides Episode 1. Again, Dr. Miriam Jorgensen and Dr. Laura Taylor. Looking forward to what comes next from the Landback research team. So thank you both.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.